Hello, space friends. So, in Star Trek, there's probably more types of space-based weapons than in any other sci-fi franchise. And if I sat here and listed them all, this video would probably be well over an hour long. So I decided not to go that direction, and instead kind of talk about the nature of Star Trek special effects, starting from all the way back in 1964, fast forwarding to about 2024 when we finish up Star Trek Discovery and we get into Strange New Worlds. Because Star Trek weapons effects are some of the most amazing effects on the screen, and we're going to talk about the nature of them and sort of the tactical application of them if we can. And let's get right into it, starting from early Star Trek all the way to present. So we'll start by talking about the very first Star Trek episode, the pilot episode, The Cage. Now in this episode we never see the Enterprise firing, but it is mentioned that they have weapons that can blast half a continent. Now it's interesting to note that their sidearms are lasers, not phasers, and perhaps the Enterprise itself uses a kind of laser. We do see the ground-based weapon that they tried to blast into the side of the facility where Pike was being held. Perhaps that's equivalent to a starship weapon, and it's never really mentioned if that's a phaser or a laser or what, but why not assume it's a laser? Even though in the Star Trek episode by The Next Generation, the episode called The Outrageous Okana, Worf reports that they're locking lasers on them, and everyone kind of scoffs and says, well, those won't even get through our navigational deflectors. Well, the thing is, I think this was written in an era where there was a lot of Star Trek versus Star Wars controversy, and that was sort of a troll to Star Wars at the time. But honestly, I think lasers can be awesome in certain ways. But the first Star Trek episode where we really saw a demonstration of starship weaponry was The Balance of Terror. And this is where the Enterprise has to fight the Romulans for the first time. And this episode is set up like a World War II battle for a surface ship versus a Nazi submarine, and was directly inspired by the movie The Enemy Below. The Romulan is the submarine, the Enterprise is the surface ship. The Romulans use a plasma torpedo to mimic the weaponry of a submarine, and the Enterprise uses only phasers, the real-life equivalent of the depth charge, or maybe a Hedgehog, which is a kind of anti-submarine rocket. Now the phasers on screen don't look anything like what we will later see, especially in the remaster. In fact, the original effect we see of the phasers would later actually become the Photon Torpedoes, while the phasers would become more of a blue beam. So apparently the first phaser was a kind of pulse or burst phaser that we saw in this episode, so that it could mimic the depth charges or the Hedgehog rockets. Does it make sense in real life? I have no idea, but this is such a beloved episode that we can kind of forgive it. But the nature of phasers changes a lot later on in Star Trek. In episodes such as Journey to Babel and The Ultimate Computer and others, this is a phaser, and this is a photon torpedo. Phasers would reappear often as this blue beam, and phaser tech is apparently not exclusive to the Federation, as we saw the Orions use them in Journey to Babel. Now other races, like the Klingons, are using something called disruptors, which is sort of a green energy bolt that's coming from the ships. Now Klingons probably have torpedoes based on this scene from the episode Errand of Mercy. It looks kind of like a photon torpedo, like the ones you would see in later Star Trek. But also there's something called anti-proton beams, which is used by the Doomsday Machine, which can totally wreck a planet, and the Doomsday Machine would actually eat the planetary material from it. We wouldn't see another anti-proton beam until years later in Voyager, but we'll get to that later. And now, we're going to get into some of the most beautiful special effects seen in Star Trek to date. Even if it's about 45 years old, it still holds up to today's standards. And that's Star Trek the Motion Picture, where we have these beautiful photon torpedoes. Are they realistic? Well, actually they're kind of less realistic than in the original series, because most of the time you're not going to see these traveling in space so slowly. But here we have the red photon torpedoes of the Klingons, and the Enterprise actually fires a blue photon torpedo at the asteroid to get out of the wormhole. But unfortunately, we don't see phasers used at all in the movie era with the exception of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And here we see these badass pulse phasers. In some ways, I feel like this is kind of an answer to the special effects in Star Wars, but they're a little bit more beam-like than the lasers in Star Wars. The lasers in Star Wars honestly aren't really lasers. But it's unknown what tactical or what advantage at all, if any, a pulsing phaser like this would have over the older beam style, but they do look awesome. I believe these kind of mimic the anti-aircraft guns or anti-missile guns used in modern times, such as the Sea Whiz used by the United States Navy. Now later on in Star Trek III, we do see some interesting Klingon weapons. Commander Krug's Bird of Prey uses a green pulse weapon, a pulse beam that looks kind of similar to phasers except for the color, to destroy the freighter. And then later, the torpedo that fires from his Bird of Prey doesn't really look like the original Klingon torpedoes seen in the motion picture, or any of the torpedoes used by the Enterprise or Reliant in Star Trek II. It looks pretty different. It's green and it's a bit fuzzy. I would say this could have actually been a plasma torpedo. After all, by this time the Klingons and Romulans have shared a lot of weapons technology. And things would change again in Star Trek V: The Final Frontier. In Star Trek V, again we have disruptors, which are kind of changed to be more blue, but otherwise they're similar to the disruptors used before. Enterprise's Photon Torpedoes are white. Now let's focus on the last original Star Trek movie, Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. I do want to note that the only weapons used in this movie are Photon Torpedoes, and they're all red, and they aren't quite as brilliant and spiky and extravagant as the one seen in Star Trek the Motion Picture, The Wrath of Khan. I feel as if somewhere between Star Trek 3 and 5, a lot of the Industrial Light and Magic team that worked on those movies were lost. But I will note that these torpedoes are all red, so unlike in The Search for Spock, General Chang's Bird of Prey fires a red torpedo. This is almost certainly a photon torpedo. Remember that General Chang's cloaked warbird fired on the Kronos 1 to mimic a Federation torpedo. In this way they could frame Kirk for attacking Chancellor Gorkon's flagship, the Kronos 1. Also later on in the Battle of Kittimir, we hear Scotty say, "She's packing quite a wallop." So I think maybe this torpedo may have even been a bit more powerful than the torpedo fired by Commander Krug's Bird of Prey back in Star Trek III. But now we have to go beyond that and talk about Star Trek: The Next Generation. By this time we have the awesome phaser beam array. And apparently the phaser beam arrays in Star Trek: The Next Generation are really a kind of Swiss Army knife. They're not made just to destroy things, but they're made for surgical precision. They're used kind of as a tool as much as a weapon. And then the photon torpedoes are similar to the movies, but a bit less spiky and less dramatic. But they are fired in these awesome torpedo spreads, which we had never seen before by that time. And also in the Next Generation era, these are firmly established to be matter-antimatter weapons, where matter clashes with antimatter to create a huge explosion of photonic radiation, hence photon torpedoes. Now, Klingon and Romulan weapons are by now firmly to be established as disruptors. But disruptors can appear as beams in the case of Romulans, but also again in the case of Romulans they can appear as bolts. And for the Klingons they always appear as a kind of energy bolt. But they're certainly not quite like the fast pulses we saw in The Search for Spock used by Commander Krug's Bird of Prey. I suppose disruptors are pretty versatile in the same way phasers can be, depending on what you want them to do. But we'll get into a little bit more iteration of phasers later on. But we do have to talk about the Borg. It's interesting to note that Worf says some kind of laser is cutting into the Enterprise's hull in the Next Generation episode Q-Who, where the Borg are first encountered, even though they had laughed at lasers earlier on. Maybe it's not quite a laser, but something else that resembles something like a laser. But the Borg have a variety of weapons. They have torpedo-like weapons, and they actually used an energy-draining weapon on the Enterprise as it was trying to chase it down. So they've got all kinds of interesting weapons. After all, they've assimilated thousands of species, so this would make sense. Oh, I forgot, I want to circle back to what the Klingon Vorcha can do. In the Star Trek Next Generation episode Redemption, it fires a kind of almost torpedo-like disruptor from this front section. So apparently disruptor weapons can be fired a lot like torpedoes, and we would see this later on in Star Trek as well. But then there is a huge weapons dance party that would break out in Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Here enters the Defiant. And the Defiant kind of changes our understanding of how phasers and Federation weapons in general work once again. The big, powerful pulse phaser cannons cause the Defiant to tactically act more like a fighter in a way, because it has to line up on the target and unleash. And apparently the Defiant was designed to attack the Borg, so I would also gather that the Defiant's pulse phasers are a rather short-range weapon. Also, we have the appearance of quantum torpedoes by this time, as well as in Star Trek First Contact. Quantum torpedoes are apparently a vast upgrade to photon torpedoes. I almost get the impression that quantum torpedoes are not fired as frequently as photon torpedoes, but when they are in play, they are much more powerful. Let's circle back to the Klingon Vorcha again. By Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the disruptor on the front of the Vorcha has changed from a torpedo-type disruptor to a beam-type disruptor. Oh gosh, can we get any consistency? And if we're going to circle back to the Vorcha, we might as well talk about the Romulan Dideritics as well, because when it was first designed, the weapons were supposed to come off of specific hard points on the Dideritics hull. But by the time the special effects team got a hold of it, all the weapons came out of this front hole right here on the front of its beak, which was actually designed to be the navigational deflector according to Andrew Probert. But the enemies in Deep Space Nine have all kinds of different weapons by this point. The Dominion has their Polaron beams, which at first could go right through Federation shields until they were adapted, and Polaron torpedoes. We rarely see the Dominion fire anything other than a beam weapon. The Breen, however, apparently have disruptors, energy dampening weapons, and perhaps plasma torpedoes? But the Breen disruptors really act more like fast torpedoes than anything else. And we enter the Voyager era, and Voyager has all kinds of different weapons. In Voyager, we're introduced to yet another Federation weapon called the Tri-Cobalt Torpedo, which Janeway used to destroy the Caretaker array. Apparently the Tri-Cobalt weapons, maybe they're not used for ship-to-ship combat that much, but for demolition of structures. And then you have the Herosian Hunters that use Tetrion weapons. There are Chronoton torpedoes used by the Krenim, which apparently change the nature of the time around the target, perhaps infused with chronoton particles. We have Borg nanoprobe torpedoes specifically designed to destroy the bioships of species 8472. We also have the return of the anti-proton beam, which is used by species 8472. And these are extremely destructive, just like the ones that were used by the Doomsday Machine way back in early Star Trek, and have the ability to destroy a planet in a very short time. And then finally we have
transphasic torpedo.
That's right, the transphasic torpedoes. For the first time, we see a weapon that can one-shot a Borg cube and destroy about 3 or 4 of them in mere seconds. And then Star Trek, like a roller coaster, takes us back in time to before the original series, and we get Star Trek Enterprise, before phasers, before photon torpedoes, before any of those things. Of course, the NX class Enterprise eventually would be able to fit something called phase cannons. The difference between this and an actual true phaser, it's never really explained. Similarly, we get the photonic warheads. The difference between this and a true photon torpedo, again, never really explained. It's my theory that a torpedo versus a missile or a warhead is something that cannot be targeted and shot. Just like in actual naval terms, it's almost impossible to target and shoot down a torpedo as it's traveling below the surface of the water. And perhaps as photon torpedoes travel, they're traveling in a state of space that doesn't allow you to quite target and shoot them, but you certainly can evade them. Other than that, all the weapons are pretty much similar to what we see later in Star Trek. The Klingons have photon torpedoes and disruptors by this point, and honestly, all the special effects of the weapons look almost exactly the same as what you'd see in Star Trek Voyager. But things would change when we get into the J.J. Abrams / Kurtzman era of Star Trek with Star Trek 2009. Like in the Kelvin universe, the weapons effects are flashy and nice, but in my opinion, none of it really holds up to the original effects that were created by Industrial Light and Magic and derivatives of Industrial Light and Magic back in the original movies. Why? Because it's kind of hard to duplicate these photon torpedoes. It's actually taken me years to get them right in my own animations, and I still am not quite satisfied with how my pulse phasers look in my own animations. And yet, nothing since really has looked as good as far as Star Trek weapons. Now in Star Trek Discovery and New Worlds, but mostly in Discovery, you see weapons pretty much, most energy weapons are pretty much just a flash of light going from one place to the other. And the torpedoes, they don't look like the original spiky, brilliant, radiant photon torpedoes. Maybe someday they'll be able to bring that back. Alright space friends, that's it for this video. Also, if you're interested in signing up as a patron to support this channel, go to patreon.com/resurrected. Patrons get access to a lot of my 3D models, and by request, I can do a 3D render with your custom name on the ship for any of the Star Trek, Star Wars, or even EVE Online 3D model assets that I have used in my videos. Just sign up as a Patreon and message me there, and I'll be happy to oblige if I can. Until next time, space friends.